Joining us for this edition of Track Record on Share Radio is a face you might recognise from TV's The School of Hard Knocks, giving people a helping hand in the world, whose name you might recognise from a number of books he's written about the art of the pitch. Or you might simply know him as a great speaker. Motivational psychologist Paul Boross is our guest on this edition of Track Record here on Share Radio. It is jolly nice to meet you. Thank you very much for coming in.
My pleasure. Very excited to be here.
And very seldom do we have a guest on Track Record who, along the way, actually has a record to talk about. And I'm sure we will talk about your pop career at some point.
Well, if we must.
But we perhaps know you best as the Pitch Doctor. The brand new book is something we will talk about as well. But also your work in psychology and business psychology and what you do with startups and people in business who need voice and direction, I guess, most of all.
Absolutely. I mean, my background originally was as a psychologist. Then I moved into entertainment and comedy and music. And when I came back to psychology, I noticed that everything had moved on. And suddenly I became sort of fascinated by the motivational psychology whereby you could change people's lives quickly. And rather than sort of, the old psychiatrist approach of getting people to lie down on the sofa, talk about their childhood, how mummy took the spoon away and the dog looked at them sideways. Actually, the new forms of psychology really didn't think that was important. And that's what fascinates me, that you can change people's lives really quickly.
So tell me about the human mind and why originally, Paul, you were so interested in this area.
I think it's the basis of everything. I mean, mind over matter. Everything we create is created from a feeling, from an attitude. And if you get that attitude right and the way your brain functions around that attitude, you can literally do anything. Think of anybody in history who's achieved anything. Have they been naysayers? Have they been people who go, well, I'll try, I'll give it a bit of a go? No. Actually, people who succeed in any walk of life succeed because they give themselves good messages. Mm. And that's what fascinates me, is how so many people actually trip themselves up by not giving themselves the right attitude that can produce success.
We have such a great conversation to come. I can feel it already with you, Paul. Your first track record, though, let me prompt you for this. You've gone for Frank and Nancy Sinatra with Something Stupid. Why does this make your list?
Well, in psychology, we talk about anchors, about certain songs that will take you back to that feeling. And this evokes my childhood, really. My best friend's dad was William G. Stewart, who you might know from 15 to 1. But he was a big TV producer in the 70s. And he loved Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. And I remember he was a little bit flash in a good way. And he had a Bentley before anybody we knew had any car at all. And we used to drive around, sit in the back and listen to Frank Sinatra and Nancy, his daughter, singing Something Stupid. And it evokes all those memories of childhood.
Then I go and spoil it all by saying something stupid like I love.
Something Stupid, Frank and Nancy Sinatra. It's the first track record choice of Paul Boross, who joins us on this edition of Track Record on Share Radio. The Pitch Doctor, but also a writer and a noted psychologist as well. We have a lot to talk about. You mentioned your early years there, riding along in the backseat of a Bentley, listening to all the hits of the day. Was there something about the Bentley where you thought, well, in my later life, I'd want a bit of this?
Oh, I actually do think that William G. Stewart, Bill, as he's always been known to me, who I still know to this day, who knew me since I was 2 years old, I think actually going to television studios and feeling that it was something desperately exciting when you got to meet Sid James, you got to meet Barbara Windsor. In fact, when I met Sid James and Barbara Windsor, we went backstage at the Victoria Palace when they were doing Carry On London. And Bill took us to meet Sid, and we went to his dressing room, and Sid had a whiskey on the go. And me and my best friend Nick were there, two sort of 10-year-old boys, sort of, wide-eyed at show business. And Sid said, "Oh, come up and meet Babs." And so he walked us up to Barbara Windsor's dressing room. And he didn't knock on the door, he just burst in, which was his way. And he said, "Babs, come and meet Bill and the boys." And Barbara Windsor was there with just a pair of tights on and some high-heeled stilettos. And she just waddled over to these two innocent 10-year-old boys, looked us straight in the eye, giggled, shook our hands, and said, "Lovely to meet you, boys," and treated it like was the most normal thing in the world. So you could say that Barbara Windsor's assets attracted me to show business in a roundabout way, in an innocent 10-year-old way.
And I imagine she's still just a bit like that. She's still just a bit like that.
Well, bizarrely, I met her many years later and told her that story. And she squealed and said...
I bet she's the sort of lady who would really remember
Oh,
as well.
she remembered and just went, "What was I like?"
Darling.
Yeah.
You were saying earlier on that our focus on psychology is less how we were brought up and the influence of our childhood these days. There's much less of a focus on that now, how our mothers treated us and so on and so forth. Yet you talk about your own school days in particular. You talk about the grounding and the learning that you did there. And you've gone as far as to say you probably learned a bit more there than you've ever done formally as a psychologist.
I think so. I think I've been influenced. I mean, I was blessed to go to a huge comprehensive school with 2,000 boys. Now, I was blessed because I survived. Lots of other people, got pushed by the wayside and probably ended up in prison and in bad places. But what it really taught me was it taught me how to deal with every type of person. Because there were people, lots of people there, who would never learn to read and write. There were people who were huge bullies. There were people who were psychologically trying to damage other people. And being around that as a youngster, if you coped, I think you came out much, much stronger. And like you say, I think I learnt more about working with people and their basic levels of psychology than you can ever learn from a textbook or doing a university degree or any kind of thing. Practical knowledge, I think, is always the best, to actually do it from the ground up.
We develop such complex relationships in our school years, don't we? And we find ourselves in the midst of other people's complex relationships, I think, during our school years. When emotions are heightened, when life is at its least predictable, perhaps, when you're 14, 15, 16?
Absolutely. And, the classic stories, I worked with most of the big comedians of my day, and the classic stories about comedy getting you out of trouble and not getting you, beaten up. Humour is one of those things that I think people don't understand is a state changer. I use a lot of humour when I'm doing keynote addresses or trainings around the world because I want people to change state. And a lot of that humour comes from understanding at school. If you could make people laugh, including the teachers, you changed their state and you made it easier for yourself.
Were you a student who applied himself?
I applied myself to things I liked. And now, having a 16-year-old son, I can see all my worst traits coming out. Fortunately, he got all his GCSEs recently, so that's a good thing. I, had to take my maths GCSE, or O-level as it was at the time, twice, because I was doing all the things I loved. I was doing speech competitions, I was doing plays, I was doing lots of sport. Anything I loved, like English, I really applied myself to. Physics, not so much.
Me neither. Me neither. My worst subject. This takes us to our next track record. This takes us to your next track record choice, Steely Dan, and it's Reelin' in the Years. Paul, why this one?
Well, I just have fond memories of my friends at school. One of my friends, Ian Hayworth, who's now a global creative director for an advertising agency, we used to sit round at his house, and his brother, Steve, had this enormous record collection. And we just used to sit around and get completely taken in by the absolute joy of this song. And it's something that just automatically brings back school days, and was one of the first things that inspired me to actually learn the guitar and become a musician.
Are you reeling in the years, stowing away the time?
This is Track Record on Share Radio, and in the record choices of Paul Boross today, Reelin' in the Years by Steely Dan. He is a psychologist, a motivational psychologist, a writer. The new book is Pitch Doctor, which is out at the moment. You may recognise the face and the name from Sky TV's School of Hard Knocks and other television appearances over the years as well. Just as a diversion away from your own school days, this is a fascinating look into how brittle, how tough our young people are in some certain parts of the country, but how, if you can find a chink, how if you can get through to them, the change can be amazing.
Absolutely. And I have a belief system that basically is that anyone can change, and change can come quickly. I think so many of the young people I've worked with on School of Hard Knocks have just lacked one key ingredient, and that's confidence. And without confidence, it's hard to move into any situation. And one of the things that we do is we use rugby as an analogy and go, well, you know what, if you can tackle a 16-stone sort of ox of a man coming towards you, what else can you do? It's about possibilities. And if you have no confidence, everything falls apart. I mean, we see people on School of Hard Knocks, and I work, with other charities and social inclusion, things like So You Want to Be on TV. If people don't understand the basics of actually being able to communicate with somebody, they are going to get left out in life. And I think it's a crying shame that so much of school is just trying to cram information into young people. For what purpose? Those young people, if they haven't got confidence, won't be able to do anything with that knowledge. So one of the things I'm trying to get government leaders to realise is that we have to be teaching communication, because they say now that 50% of the jobs that exist today won't exist in 10 or 15 years. What's going to be left? Communication, creativity, and maybe a few other things round that. But we need to be teaching everybody that communication is the key.
You've mentored dozens.
Hundreds.
Quite a few hundred, actually, yeah. of these young people, and is there something that unites them all? Is there something that you see that you're concerned about in all of them? You've already mentioned confidence, but once that is built and once that's in place, can they fly anywhere?
Yes. I mean, we've had people who have literally gone from doing 16 years in prison on and off, who have gone on to actually not only be one of the best personal trainers in the country, but also be very comfortable in media, and then has gone back into prison to actually teach people what is possible. And I suppose one of the things is the art of the possible. Is if there's a saying in psychology which goes, whatever you say to yourself becomes your reality. And what you find with people who don't achieve in life is they are usually talking to themselves in a voice and in a way that limits what they can do. Because if you say to yourself, I can't do that, there's no way I can do, or this radio game isn't for people like me, it is your reality. And the way the mind works is we create a reality. So one of the things I do with people is I get them to talk to themselves in a different way, because we essentially hypnotize ourselves into failure. And that's all through whatever you say to yourself becomes your reality. If you can manage to say something positive, guess what? Your whole life will change for the better.
Let's hear your next track record choice. It's The Clash and it's London Calling. And I know that you've chosen this because you have a creative side. You've written, you've performed, and there's something of this track that ties that side of your career all together.
Absolutely. I mean, as a London boy born and bred, I mean, I do have a deep sort of feeling and love for the city. But this has the ethos of punk, and it's that can-do attitude, which I think ties in with my whole theory on psychology. Anybody can do anything. And these were guys, the punks, were people who learnt 3 chords and then went, guess what? I'm going to make them the best and the most passionate 3 chords I can, and learnt from there. And I think London Calling is the epitome of that, because it's actually very, very musical, but boy, does it pack a punch.
London calling to the zombies of death. Quit holding out and draw another breath.
Paul Boross is alongside on this edition of Track Record on Share Radio, and his latest choices, The Clash and London Calling. He's a motivational psychologist and he's a writer as well. We've been hearing about we will hear a little bit more about your pop career, but shall we talk about pitch, Doctor, and leader on the pitch as well? Because your thinking, your writing, your work isn't just about business. You're drawing strengths and learning from all sectors in the UK. In fact, your latest work takes you into collaboration with a well-known sporting star, doesn't it?
Yes. The new book, Leader on the Pitch, is written with Scott Quinnell, who is a rugby legend, essentially. And we have worked together for the last 7 or 8 years on School of Hard Knocks. And we got to talking over, you're away in different places, Glasgow, Wales, Birmingham. And so you're spending sort of the best part of 8 weeks there working with the young people. And we got to talking about what is a leader. And it was very interesting that Scott and I had very similar views on the fact that leadership, and this book is not really about the typical, what do leaders look like, what do leaders do? It's really about how leaders communicate with themselves and others. Because there's a line in the book, what do you call a leader standing without a team? Just a bloke taking a walk. Because without the team and without the interaction with the team, there is no leader. And so the core of the book is about how we can use the wisdom of rugby resilience and how we can map that over into how to succeed in business leadership.
But rather more generally, I personally believe, as an amateur, keen amateur sports person myself, there's a lot we learn about discipline in sport, about learning in sport, about structure in sport, and often just the basic physical lift that upping your heart rate can give you can translate so effectively into so many other areas of life.
Absolutely. I mean,
particularly business.
Oh, absolutely in business. Well, I mean, there's a Chinese saying which is very relevant. We often say this when we're talking to young people on School of Hard Knocks, but it's relevant to leader on the pitch as well. The Chinese saying is, if you want successes, get knocked down 7 times, get up 8. And that's really, on a rugby pitch, that's what you have to do.
And you would argue that when you play rugby in particular, it's a contact sport. It can be brutal at times. You have to learn how to fall.
Absolutely. And I think business is a contact sport as well. Now, it may not be physical, but mental contact. People will challenge you all the time. You have to be resilient. You have to be strong.
And the best entrepreneurs are pugilists as well, aren't they?
Well,
maybe.
Well, they understand. If you're talking about pugilism in terms of being an art, it is an art. It's the way to actually. Well, in pugilism, you're trying to damage your opponent, but in business, what you're trying to do is bring people with you. And that's the art of business. Leadership is not just about I stand up and I tell you all in the same tone of a voice that we're going this way and follow me. Well, that's not the way people work. The psychology of the way people work is about understanding individuals, having a different relationship with each individual, inspiring people to want to follow you, and then perhaps being brave enough to give them their head in the sense that I trust you. I know you'll do this well. So then you are a different type of leader, but everybody needs a different. Some people need an arm round them. Some people need a kick up the backside. The trick in leadership is understanding everyone is different and everyone needs a different message.
How did you come across Scott?
Well, it's actually funny. Will Greenwood was the person I met first. We were at President's Day at Wimbledon. Big tennis fans. All of us are big tennis fans, actually. And Will and I were sat beside each other. And he started to say, I'm fascinated by the whole thing of psychology in sport. Now, Will Greenwood, I'm talking about, had won in 2003 the Rugby World Cup. And we started talking about, what makes a difference. He goes, God, can we go out to lunch and talk about this? And so we started talking, and he said, we've started doing this TV show called School of Hard Knocks. Would you come along for a couple of hours and talk to the guys? Now, this was 8 years ago, and suddenly that one thing, and it's like one meeting changes your life. And the bizarre thing is things come full circle, because the book Leader on the Pitch, written by Scott Quinnell and myself, has the foreword by Sir Clive Woodward, who coached the England World Cup winning team.
There's a name, I think, that would make many people, whatever their area of life, sit up and think, yes, this is something we need to listen to. Your next track record choice is from Wet, Wet, Wet. You've gone for Sweet Little Mystery. It's from 1987. Why does this pop up on your list?
Well, I absolutely love the song. It's like white, blue-eyed soul. And I don't think that many people in Britain actually sort of got that they were a really tight soul band. But really, in my first band, Morris Minor and the Majors, with Tony Hawkes and Philip Judge, we did a lot of gigs and a lot of television shows with the Wets, as we called them. And they were cheeky, funny, charming, brilliant musicians. And I have so many great memories of spending time with them in television studios and radio studios. And on the first Top of the Pops I ever did, Wet, Wet, Wet were on the same Top of the Pops. And we were nervous. And they were so supportive and so kind that I've absolutely loved them ever since.
Wet, 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 Sweet Little Mystery. It's a track record choice of this week's guest. It's Paul Boross, who's alongside. The Pitch Doctor, motivational psychologist. You'll recognise him from his TV appearances as the team psychologist on TV's School of Hard Knocks, and several times now, I think, a published author as well. The latest book is out at the moment, in partnership with Scott Quinnell, of course. Just sticking with this creative side to you, because it's not all about study, it's not all about writing, it's not all about sitting behind a desk and the rather more serious side of the study and the work that you've done over the years. You've been in the band. You told us about Morris Minor and the Majors. And kids, if you're listening and you don't know what on earth we're talking about, I urge you to go and Google it right now. But it hasn't stopped and started there for you, because you've popped up on the comedy circuit as well.
Well, yes. Morris Minor and the Majors originally started as a comedy and music act on the comedy circuit, playing places like Jongleurs and Comedy Store. But that sort of led us to actually going to work in America as well. So we had an extraordinary career. We had a couple of hits. We did lots of corporate stuff. We headlined at the biggest clubs in America, places like Caroline's and Catch a Rising Star. And it was just a most extraordinary thing, because I went from, because as a young child, I was obsessed with Top of the Pops. And I thought day and night, and dreamed and envisioned myself and visualised me being on there.
Was this something more than a simple childhood dream?
Oh, it was an obsession. I was obsessed with music.
This sounds very single-minded.
Oh, well, you see, as a psychologist, I can now look back on it and think, well, actually, what I was doing is what I was reverse engineering. This being on Top of the Pops. Now, when I had it in my mind as a 11, 14, 16-year-old boy, I thought I was going to be the new David Bowie. Actually, the way life works is sometimes you get what you want, but it looks very different. So I was suddenly singing stutter rap, and as part of Morris Minor and the Majors, and we were Britain's answer to the Beastie Boys. And where the Beastie Boys used to go in and wreck hotel rooms, we used to come in behind and clean them up.
Because you knew that your mums would tell you off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so
went the line, or something similar.
It was. And it's but life, throws you curveballs, but you can achieve anything. It's just not always what you thought it was.
It might look very different.
It might look very different, and it did.
So tell me about Steeler's Wheel, which is next up on your track record choices and stuck in the middle with you, because this harks to that period, doesn't it?
It does. At the same time as I was doing Morris Minor, my best friend from school, who is, before he was a world-famous international chef, was Ainsley Harriott. And we used to travel around the world together. And in Morris Minor and Majors, we did a lot of work for Virgin Atlantic and flew all over the world. And rather cheekily, I said to Ainsley, "Do you fancy going to Miami for Christmas?" And he said, "Well, yes, of course I do, but I can't afford it. And I went, what about if I got us free flights? And he went, how are you going to do that? Well, Morris Minor Majors used to pay their way over to America by playing on the plane. So I went to the airline and said, I've got another act. And it's called the Calypso Twins, completely made up. And they believed in me and said, OK, you can play on the plane and get your free round trip to Miami. So me and Ainsley, our first ever gig was playing in every class on a plane at 35,000 feet. That was some first gig.
That sounds like amazing chutzpah. Certainly does.
Well, and Stuck in the Middle with You is all about, for me, how Ainsley and I have been friends since we were 11 years old and been through some incredible adventures. And I always feel like I'm looking round and saying, guess what? I'm stuck in the middle with you.
Right here I am, stuck in the middle with you.
Steelers Wheels, Stuck in the Middle with You. Paul Boross is alongside on this edition of Track Record on Share Radio. His latest book, Leader on the Pitch, is, by the looks of it, part of a series where you've used the word pitch as your anchor point here. Pitch Up, the Pitching Bible, the Pocket Pitching Bible. You're known as the Pitch Doctor, of course. On that word, can we just stick there for a moment? Because in business, I would imagine that people with great ideas come unstuck, not because there's anything wrong with their idea, but perhaps wrong with the way they communicate it. Perhaps they fail on their confidence. Perhaps they just don't know how to negotiate the side of corporate life that they need to in order to secure funding or to secure support or to secure a mentor. And there's nothing wrong with their central, very solid idea. Absolutely.
And I think you've put it brilliantly, Sue, if I might say so. Because some people find it very hard to believe. You can have the best idea in the world, but if you can't convince somebody, if you can't pitch it in a way that they want to hear it and they accept it, you've lost. I mean, if you look at programs like Dragon's Den, for instance, a lot of the time, and I've worked with Peter Jones and some of the other dragons, a lot of the time they're looking in the eye of the person and going, can I work with this person? And so, in pitching, I always say that you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And it's crucial because as human beings, we tend to make up our minds in 2 to 3 seconds about whether we're going to like somebody. And it's very, very hard to convince somebody to buy anything if they've decided they don't like you. So
it's very hard to undo that first impression, isn't it? Nigh on impossible.
It is nigh on impossible. And I say to people, think of a time when you haven't got on with somebody and you desperately wanted to get them back on side. How long's that taken? And people go, gosh, it's months. And it's like trying to turn a tanker around. And from a psychological perspective, the reason for that is, as human beings, once we've made a decision, we like to think that we're right, so we stick to it. I mean, have a look at Brexit. People have made a decision. They don't want to be wrong. So even if all the facts point in the other direction, psychologically they're going, no, I was right. And that's the reason why, when I train people all over the world in pitching and I take people on pitches, I talk to them that the most important thing is the rapport. I always say the first chapter in the Pitching Bible was called It's All About Them. Mm-hmm. Because if you are pitching over the top or at people. When I work with people from Google in America, one guy said to me, some people in a pitch just want to show up and throw up. And that's what people do. They just have information and chuck it at somebody.
Just want to tell you everything.
Absolutely.
And it's not quite like that. James Taylor's Your Smiling Face makes your track record choices, Paul. And this is a very personal story.
It is. My son, Sam, who's now a musician and an actor, I blame the parents, to be honest with you, he changed my life. My son was one of those children who just smiled all the time. He'd go up to strangers, and he had this extraordinary innate talent to just walk into rooms, smile at people and get them to smile back. And as a psychologist, I used to look on in awe and go, oh my goodness, all I've got to do is keep that going, that thing. And his smiling face really changed my world perspective in a lot of ways about what's important. What's important is that you go and you greet people. I always say to audiences around the world, I walk into a room assuming everyone is lovely. And that was really taught to me by my son, watching Sam walk into the room. And as a child, if you walk in and you think everybody's lovely, guess what? They become lovely because they have nowhere to go. So this song is all about Sam.
Whenever I see your smiling face, I have to smile myself because I love you. Yes, I do.
James Taylor and Your Smiling Face. It's a track record choice of Paul Boross, who's joined us for this edition of Track Record on Share Radio from School of Hard Knocks. You might recognise the name and the face and the way of working, of course, as well. He was one-third of Morris Minor and the Majors back in the late 1980s. You've written extensively, but you've always had this interest in psychology, and you've really chosen, after having tucked Morris Minor and the Majors and the rest to one side for a while, you've decided to focus on this. Would you say it was a change of career to go back to it, or?
Well, because I'd studied it, and I'd actually, because I'd studied it early on, when I was working with people in the Comedy Store, the Julian Clarys, the Paul Mertons, the Mike Myers, Phil Jupiters, Mark Thomas, Sandy Toksvigs, we were all a big gang. But some of the people on the Comedy Store knew that I had background in psychology, and so used to ask me to help them out. And one day, somebody who I won't name, very famous, came to me and said, I've lost my confidence. I can't go on stage, and I don't know what to do. And the next week, he had to do a live TV show. And he came to me, and the old forms of psychology that I knew didn't really cater for that. It was very talking based and, thing. And so I sought out all the new forms, the neuro-linguistic programmings, the thought field therapies, to see if there was something that could help him with. And I found the best person in Europe, and I took him to this person. And essentially, he changed him in one session. And I went, I need to know more about that. So actually, off the back of, Sam changing my life, I wanted to get all these tools to be able to use them with Sam and give him all those tools to be able to use. So I completely immersed myself in learning all the forms of new motivational psychology. And I loved it from the start. And I found that I had a real passion for changing people's lives. And it gave me as much of a buzz as performing had given me for all those years.
And it's perhaps no accident that your second to last track record choice is Billy Swan's I Can Help. Tell me about this.
Well, it is. I mean, it sounds kind of corny, but it is one of my favourite
There's room in everyone's life for cheese.
There is a little bit of room. But who moved my cheese? I Can Help. It kind of became, when I was going back, and I spent 2.5 years teaching doctors at Guy's, King's and St Thomas's, it was just that revelation that I can help. And just being able to change one person's life is such a privilege and such a gift that I became more and more passionate about it. And I sought people out. And now people always go, well, doesn't it get annoying when people call you for help? And I go, it never gets tired. It never gets annoying. When friends of mine's children, have a problem, actually, it's the nicest thing in the world to have something that you can share that can really have a ripple effect on their lives. Because when you go into, like we do on School of Hard Knocks, very, very disadvantaged communities, and you change one person's life, the ripple effects are extraordinary. It changes their family's life, their children's life. It changes their community's life. And that is the biggest gift of all. It's a gift to me every time I get invited into somebody's life and given the chance to help them. That's the biggest privilege of all.
It would sure do me good, do you good, let me help.
Billy Swan and I Can Help. You've been listening to Track Record on Share Radio. The songs, the conversation from Paul Boross on this edition. His latest book is out at the moment. It's a collaboration with rugby legend Scott Quinnell, and it's called Leader on the Pitch, in tandem with several other titles that talk about pitch and pitching up and all the rest. Just to end this conversation, really, is there going to be a next big change in life for you? Or is it simply enough that the world of psychology is change enough for you?
Well, I think that psychology is always changing and I'm always learning. I'm one of those people who seeks out sort of, neuroscientists and invites them out to lunch just to see if I can learn something new. So I think when you're dealing with the mind, you'll never stop learning. And so I'm always exploring new ways, quicker ways to get change into people. I just love it. It's my true passion. And I think I have found my true calling for life.
It's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure, genuinely, to have chatted with you on this edition of Track Record on Share Radio. And your last choice is from the Specials. Tell me what it is and why you've chosen it.
Enjoy yourself. And then in parentheses, it's later than you think. I'm a big believer in actually grabbing every moment of life and shaking it for all it's worth. Because we're only here once. And, my father died a couple of years ago, and he was the kind of person who actually said, you've only got one go-round. Actually go for it. Go for your dreams. Go for everything. And really, that's what I want for people. It's also, I think, just the most positively energetic song you can feel. You can feel the vibrancy. And as I said earlier, if you want anybody to go into any state, you have to go into that state first. And the Specials in this track have a state of joy. And I hope other people get the joy too.
Paul Boross, thank you for joining us on Track Record on Share Radio.
Thank you, Sue. It was a great pleasure.
Enjoy yourself. It's later than you think. Enjoy yourself while you're still in the pink.
Track Record with Sue Dugan.